Would you kill for a glass of port? In the Oxford way of death, where the hallowed halls of St. Pothinus's Oxford College are alive with more than just dusty books, the fellows, entangled in their routines and rituals, find their complacency disrupted with hilariously dark consequences. As new ideas ripple through, academic eccentricities give way to just a touch of murder. Robert Barnard delivers a captivating comedic tale where mysterious mishaps meet sharp humour, turning scholarly life into a brilliant farce. This is Tony Walker, narrator of the Classic Detective Stories podcast. Come on in and listen to The Oxford Way of Death by Robert Barnard. The Oxford Way of Death by Robert Barnard. St. Pothinus Hall is not one of the most distinguished colleges of the University of Oxford. Its academic record is frankly deplorable, a fact in which many of the dons take a twisted kind of pride. Nor is it one of the younger and livelier colleges. I myself, at 47, am the second youngest of the fellows. The vast majority are well into their 60s or older. I once saw one of them reading over a list of the members of the Russian or Chinese Politburo with their ages and chuckling so much he blew snuff all round the senior common room. But compared to more normal institutions, we are very old indeed. It has happened twice in the last year that a student would begin to read his weekly essay to a normally comatose old gentleman, only to find, on concluding his piece, that he had been reading for some time to a corpse. One of the young gentlemen to whom this happened let out a howl of horror and ran amok into Burton's quad, screaming and tearing his hair. The other retrieved his books from the floor around him, placed his essay back in its folder, and went and had a quiet word with Jenkins the porter. His conduct was much approved. On the evening this all starts, I sat at high table and looked around at my fellow fellows, that is the sort of joke they like, and thought what a pathetic lot they all were. Wrinkled, bald, shriveled, having trouble with dentures, respiration, and prostate glands. With some old people you can say in effect, well, at least they've had a good life, or an interesting or exciting one. But the lives of these dons made housemen's, by comparison, an existence jam-packed with incident. The senior common room was still chuckling about a brief and unsuccessful fling our Mr. Peddy, Divinity, had had with a lady don at St. Anne's, and that was back in 1934. So anyway, there we all sat, Macnaghten, the master, Peddy of the brief fling, Hugo Carmody, history, Pritchard Jones, medicine, Wickling, classics, and the rest who play little part in this story and who shall be left nameless, and myself, Peter Borthwick, English. Oh yes, and Oberon Smythe, the one who is younger than I. Oberon was elected in 1970, and at the interview he looked sober, discreet, well-washed. He came, we knew, from a minor public school, as we all did. When he arrived to take up residence 6 months later, he had hair a foot long, wore caftans, was into drugs, revolution, and the gay scene, and used language that hadn't been heard at high table since the 18th century. We were properly conned. 12 years or so had tamed him, as it had most of his generation, but he was still spoken of as our big mistake. As we were spooning the last of the cabinet pudding into our mouths, St. Pothinus is not renowned for its kitchen either. The master launched himself, as was inevitable, into the subject of the next meeting of the senior common room, to take place the following week. These little excitements in our lives cast long shadows before them. "A busy time is ahead of us, I fear," he began in that disagreeable chainsaw voice of his, which nevertheless had a certain authority and ensured silence when he raised it above its normal whine. "And a long meeting, too. For a start, there's a question of admissions for next year." All the old gentlemen around him sighed. If they had their way, there would be no admissions, no more undergraduates. They had a vague sense that 200 years ago this would have been possible, and that they lived in a degenerate age. "No problem, surely, about admissions," said Peddy, as the port began to go round. "They all come up and take the scholarship exams, and we give the places to the sons of old boys, as usual." "You forget," neighed the master, "that the old boys are not producing many sons. Not enough." "No, hardly a philoprogenitive lot," said Whitling, with his horrid laugh, like 20 French horns doing the prelude to Der Rosenkavalier. "We could always give the places to the best applicants," I said cautiously, for new ideas are not welcome at Potty's. "I know what that means," yelped Peddy, wagging an accusing finger. "You want brains! Brains! Ha!" "Besides," said Pritchard Jones seriously, "it would mean reading their scholarship papers." "What are you talking about, E.H.?" bellowed Hugo Carmody from the foot of the table. "Admissions," I shouted back. "Well, really," said Hugo Carmody with a knowing wink, "it is quite infuriating. He was a friend of war and acting and people back in the 20s, but if he was a dog then, he certainly has had his day by now. He uses his deafness as a weapon, and when we shout at him, he invariably seems to turn what we say in his mind into something indecent, making us feel like smutty schoolboys." To shut him up, the master proposed a toast. "Our benefactor, the poet-priest Hetherington," he neighed. More priest than poet, more gentleman than priest, more bon viveur and hanger of poachers and discontented peasantry than gentleman. We drank the health of Edmund Hetherington, 1711 to 1779, whose entry in the Oxford Companion to English Literature runs to 1.5 lines. It was due to the happy accident of his having died immediately after writing the one will of some 30, which disinherited both his sons and his daughter simultaneously, that the college was rolling in money. We repeated his name in hushed tones and sipped reverently. "Then," said the master, "there is the question of elections." "What are you talking about, eh?" yelled Carmody again. About appointing new fellows," I shouted back. "Really?" sniggered Carmody. "Whatever next?" We all sighed. "There are, of course, 2 places to fill, due to the untimely deaths of poor Purvis and Matheson," resumed the master. "St. Pothinus is the only place in the world where death at 76 and 81 could be described as untimely. It has been suggested to me by the Vice-Chancellor that this time we should make an all-out effort." There was a sigh. He had lost his audience already. That phrase had put them all off. "To appoint somebody younger, to ensure the future of the college," as he put it. He looked around sardonically. Everyone looked bewildered. "What frightful balderdash," said Peddy, looking from face to face, seeming quite confident that not only he, but all of us, would be blessed with eternal life on earth. "We could make another big mistake," muttered Pritchard Jones, in the sort of mutter designed to call cattle home on the hills of North Wales. "Oh, God," said Oberon Smythe, "when will I graduate to being just a little mistake?" "I told the Vice-Chancellor," said the master, satisfied with our reactions, "I fear with a touch of asperity, that the cult of the young cut no ice with us, and would not be allowed to destroy the traditional ethos of St. Pothinus. No, indeed. Nevertheless, there are these elections. We have to have a new fellow in French. You know my opinion of studying modern languages at a university, but there it is. The fellowship is vacant, and then, perhaps more difficult, there is the fellowship in ancient Persian." The fellowship in ancient Persian had been held by Harold Purvis, whose death had sent his one pupil screaming into Burton Quad. Since his death, his pupil had been as lacking in tuition as he undoubtedly was in savoir-faire, since there was only one such fellowship in the university. Not surprisingly, many were the years when Purvis managed to attract not one single undergraduate pupil. "I don't see the difficulty," suddenly chirped up Whitling. There was an edge to his voice that I knew and did not like. It meant mischief, wanton, senile malice. "Oh?" whinnied the master. "You have a candidate?" "I don't have a candidate. I know there will be a candidate. There is only one person in Britain qualified for the position, and that person will certainly apply, positions in that field being by no means plenteous. No, indeed, we are nearly, very nearly, unique, breathed the master with immense satisfaction. I hope it is not a young person, Whitling? 32, I believe, master. Oh, dear. Very young indeed. It seems the decision will be taken out of our hands. You say there is virtually no alternative. No, master, said Whitling, with what was obviously some secret satisfaction. And I'm told that Sandowa Bulawa is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. There was a moment's silence. What was that name? Bellowed Carmody, who could hear when he wanted to, from the end of the table. Don't tell me it's some damned foreigner, for God's sake. No, born in Britain, quite the home-made article. But the name, insisted the master, is not English, no. Tanganyikan, I believe, or whatever they call the place these days. Mother was Kenyan, I'm told. Then he's not, you're not telling us. Black as your hat, yes, master. Gracious heavens, said the master. Whatever next? It's a retreat to barbarism, said Peddy. Something must be done, neighed the master, at his most imperative. I feel the modern world has suddenly rapped, most brutally, at our door. Personally, said Oberon Smythe, I rather fancy the idea. It was all too clear what form the idea took for Smythe. Exclusively sexual. He was imagining a splendid black lover. But I felt I had to back him up. If we refused to appoint the man, I said, we would certainly be in contravention of the Race Relations Act. Heavens above, said Pritchard Jones. What's that? I explained at some length, ending up, if we have no adequate grounds for refusing him the fellowship, he could certainly appeal to the tribunal. Admirably expounded, cut in Whitling as I concluded, and now his voice had a suggestion of real mirth, which absolutely made the blood run cold. But I must correct you, pedantically, no doubt, on one little detail. You have been referring to Sandowa Bulawa throughout as he. However, the correct personal pronoun would be the third person feminine. She, dear boy. She. And he chortled that awful laugh that sounded like whooping Straussian French horns. But that's splendid. She's not eligible. The master's voice faded away. This third shock left him looking as if he had heard the opening of Beethoven's Fifth, played by massed Midland brass bands and amplified 1,000-fold. He looked at Whitling with outraged approach. For the powers that be at St. Pothinus's had been caught in a trap of their own devising. Some years before, when all the Oxford colleges were changing their statutes, recruiting female dons, even admitting women students, we had, under strong pressure from the university authorities, declared all our senior appointments open to female applicants. We, or rather they, had done this on the clear understanding that nothing whatever was to come of it. I distinctly remembered Whitling at the meeting chuckling his horrible chuckle and saying, "We declare them eligible, and we just don't appoint any." It seemed to most of them an awfully jolly wheeze at the time. I had no doubt that the master was remembering this now. "Whitling," he said, "this is at least in part your doing. I shall rely on you to find some way of getting us out of it." "Out of it?" crowed Whitling. "Why should I want to get us out of it?" "Jolly good idea. Pretty young black thing. Brighten the place up. Spruce us up a bit, too. I believe she's a very lively little thing. Modern and all that. What's the phrase? With it." "Then what on earth is she studying ancient Persian for?" demanded Pritchard Jones. "I'm told she has a Protestant mission background from her parents, went up to Cambridge to study theology, got into New Testament Greek, went on from there, lost her religion, but proved a whiz kid in ancient languages, studied Persian at the Sorbonne." "Heavens above!" bellowed Carmody. "It doesn't seem possible. What are girls coming to?" I have it, shrieked the master, a rare and terrifying smile wreathing his aged face. "The fellowship can be changed. Its terms can be altered. We can turn it into a fellowship in geography, or Spanish, or comparative something or other. That," he concluded triumphantly, "is possible under the terms of Edmund Hetherington's will, the endower of the fellowship." "Quite," said Whitling, "it is possible, providing the fellows are unanimous in desiring the change." "Well," magisterially, "they will not be unanimous. I myself do not desire the change. I must uphold the importance of the dead languages," he sniggered. "I have no doubt that Mr. Dr. Smythe, being a modern young man, will not wish the nature of the fellowship to be changed in order to exclude a member of the female sex." Now, Oberon Smythe is one of the few homosexuals who seem genuinely to dislike women, but he too felt himself caught in one of Whitling's fork-like traps. No, of course not," he muttered. "And you, Borthwick," continued Whitling, turning to me, "a liberal young fellow like you would naturally like to see the college open to women." "Of course," I said, with a touch of priggishness that comes, I think, from my Scottish ancestry. "I would certainly be against changing the terms of the fellowship, if that were the motive." "3 dissenting," said Whitling in tones of triumph. "Not a chance of a unanimous vote, master? Not a chance." It was death to the master's hopes. All his powers of command seemed to have left him. He summoned Jenkins the porter, who led him from table back to his residence. As he staggered off, I saw him removing his dentures, something he only does in public when he is very upset. The rest of us broke up raggedly, and the evening concluded in less of an alcoholic fug than usual. I'm not quite sure why Whitling did all this. I'm convinced that when he suggested altering the statuses to admit women, he had no such far-sighted project as this in mind. Nor, of course, did he have any particular love of women as such. I'm sure no tingling of lust warmed his aged loins, or had since about the time of Chu Chin Chow. I think it was just mischief. That's the trouble when you get older. Either you think you're immortal, and this gives you a godlike carelessness of consequences, or else you know you'll soon be dead, and won't have to put up with the results of your mischief. If the latter was Whitling's calculation, he was all too soon to be proved right. In the week that followed, I absented myself from college as much as possible, for squabbling geriatrics are hardly congenial companions. My only insight into how things were going I obtained one evening, when, after a late tutorial, I went over to the buttery bar to have a beer before going home for dinner. The door stood open, and I heard the booming voice of Hugo Carmody. "Well, I don't know if the master has any plans, but I'm damned sure something's got to be done." I lingered in the twilight outside the door. "If only we could get something on them." "Absolutely," I said, in the sharp voice of Peddy. "Smythe would be easy, what? Threatened to go to the police about his boyfriends." "That wouldn't do. It's not illegal anymore." "What? Not illegal? Good heavens! I must stop slipping Higgins £5 notes." Higgins was Carmody's scout. He was reaching retirement age, so he wouldn't greatly miss his £5 notes. There was silence for a moment. "Then there's Borthwick. Not much to be got on him. A somewhat dim personality. What?" "His wife is sleeping with the milkman, you know," came the thin, malicious voice of Peddy. They chuckled about this like crazy. "But all the fellows' wives sleep with one or other of the roundsmen. I always said that marriage doesn't do. And really, it's hardly a lever." They subsided into silence, and I made a bustling entrance. I had a quick beer, and resolved to be home more in the mornings. Nothing much happened that I knew of until the night before the senior common room meeting. My wife was at an Oxfam gathering, she said, and I was forced to eat in hall. Dinner was uneventful, but unpleasant. No one was talking to Whitling, so he was forced to talk to me and Smythe. Given the choice, I preferred Pritchard Jones, who was at least inoffensive, or even Hugo Carmody, because I was always hoping to get out of him details of a trip he made to Paris with War in 1924. But Whitling it was, and we were forced to put up with his cackling malice, his sly self-satisfaction, his trumpeted chortlings. After dinner, we adjourned as usual to the senior common room. I poured myself a second glass of port, and Whitling did the same. Smythe took a hard slug of whisky, and the master took coffee and brandy. Whitling stood by the mantelpiece, and though the rest of us wanted to cluster round the fire, we none of us wanted to be too near to him. "St. Pothinus," said the master, who had placed himself in the centre of the room. We all toasted the patron saint of the college, dead at 90, in a dungeon, and then the master fixed Whitling with an eye, bleary, but designed to threaten and command. "Well, Whitling, we're all hoping to hear you've changed your mind." "Changed my mind, master," innocently. "About altering the terms of the fellowship." "Oh, that!" dismissively, as if the matter had passed completely out of his head. "No, master, I fear that my opinions on that subject are very much as they were last week." "I see. So, to satisfy a foolish whim, to enjoy a bit of wilful trouble-making, you are prepared to jeopardize the best traditions of St. Pothinus." What did Winston Churchill say about traditions of the Navy, rum, sodomy, and the lash? I suppose you could say that St. Pothinus's were port, sodomy, and the third-class honours degree. Personally, I believe tradition should be evaluated empirically, the obsolete ones discarded. What? "What you are proposing," snapped Peddy, "is craven concession to the spirit of modernity." "Concession?" chortled Whitling. "Not at all. I propose welcoming it in, a breath of fresh air from the contemporary scene, apropos of which I have a picture." He skipped, chuckling and snuffling, over to his briefcase in a corner by the door. "A snapshot, I think you call it, of the young lady herself, some years ago, taken when she was performing in the Cambridge Footlights Review. Ah, here it is." He produced from his case an old, slightly brown copy of the Sun newspaper, and we clustered round to view a picture of a distinctly handsome black girl in leopard skin briefs, apparently topless, clutching a microphone in the centre of the stage, swaying her hips and crooning into it. "My word," said Carmody. "I suppose that was taken after she lost her faith." None of the rest of us could think of anything more adequate to say. "There," said Whitling triumphantly, looking around us, and thrusting the photograph at the master, who was wandering over from the fireplace. "Now you can see that Miss Beliewer will certainly provide something different in the college. What? Can't see anyone paying to see us topless, eh? Except perhaps Dr. Smythe in some dubious Soho locale." He pottered back towards the fire. "No, this is going to be a bit of a change, isn't it? I hope she fits in. Do you feel she will? Don't you sometimes feel you've got into a bit of a rut here, all of you? That life is lacking its zest, needs a bit of spice? Suddenly, our lives are going to acquire a whole new flavour." He picked up his glass of port and drank triumphantly. Suddenly, an expression of horror or rage crossed his face, which set in a terrible grimace. His hand dropped the glass and went to his throat. A strangled cry escaped him, and he crashed forward onto the hearthrug. "Dear me," said the master, "Mr. Whitling appears to be unwell." I was down on the hearthrug beside him, pulling open his dinner jacket, feeling his pulse. No one else moved. I didn't need long. "He's dead," I said. "How unfortunate," said the master, taking a fortifying sip of his brandy. "Struck down in his prime, in the midst of life. The ways of Providence are strange." "Providence my foot," I said brutally. "You saw how he died. He's been poisoned." "Mr. Borthwick! Mr. Borthwick! What an extraordinary suggestion. Most improper. You've been reading too many books by that, what's the thriller writer? Mr. Wilkie Collins. Can't you smell it? Almonds. It must have been in the port." "Gad! Founder's Port," said Hugo Carmody. "I can't smell a thing," said Peddy. "Look, I'm drinking port. It's perfectly all right." And he downed his drink. "I'm drinking port too," I said. "It must have been put into his glass." He'd already drunk half of it. "It must have been put in his glass while we were all looking at this damned newspaper." Come, Mr. Borthwick, let us not lose grip of our logic," said the master, in his unpleasant silken whine. If we were all looking at the newspaper, none of us could have put anything in his glass. One of us must have held back, I said, crinkling my forehead with effort. One of us wasn't there. I had a vision of the paper being thrust at the master as he came from the direction of the fireplace. I looked at him, and he stared unwaveringly back. We were all gaping at it, as far as I remember, said Pritchard Jones. Handsome filly? Quite, said the master. We were all over that side of the room. Now, let us forget this frivolous suggestion, and— No doctor on earth is going to sign a death certificate, master, I said. There'll have to be an autopsy. I'm sure Dr. Pritchard Jones will have no hesitation in signing the necessary formalities, said the master smoothly. Pritchard Jones? He hasn't practised medicine since before penicillin was invented. I believe you are eligible to sign the necessary forms, inquired the master, in his high whinny, turning to Pritchard Jones. Course I am. Most uncalled for remark. Offensive. I believe there was some history of heart trouble, wasn't there? Think there was. No, he went to his doctor last week. I can square it with Smithers. Man's practically senile. Needn't be any question of a post-mortem. There we are, then. That's all quite clear. There need be no question. Master, even if you have a certificate, I explained patiently, no undertaker is going to bury that corpse without getting a police clearance first. Why on earth not? Well, look. I turned over the corpse. The face of Mr. Whitling, blue and twisted into a hideous grimace of torment that seemed to drag his wrinkled skin tight over his aged skull, gazed horrifyingly up at us. Well, he was nobody's idea of a dreamboat at the best of times, said Oberon Smythe. I've no doubt Lockett will not make any trouble, said the master. We'll get old Lockett, not the boy. He's a fusser. Old Lockett is quite as old as any of us, and nearly blind. He's very understanding. He won't want to lose us. We've been one of their most regular customers over the years. You're covering up. You are accessories after a murder. Covering up? Really, Mr. Borthwick, you will be suggesting next that I committed murder myself. He looked at me, and I, weakly, looked down at the floor. Well, how do I know that you didn't? How do I know that you're not all in it? Pritchard Jones, what poison is it that smells like almonds? Don't know, my boy. Have to look it up in my books. It must have been brought here. I looked desperately round the room. Look, here it is. I picked up from one of the side tables a tiny glass phial. This is how it was brought. No doubt it contains some medicament that poor Whitling was taking for his heart, said the master. He didn't have heart trouble, I said. We'd have heard about it endlessly if he had. Smythe, you can see what's happening, can't you? Can I rely on you to support me? Fight your own battles, said Oberon Smythe, making for the door. I've no love for the police, believe me. As far as I'm concerned, I went straight to my rooms after Hall. Haven't been near the SCR all evening. Bye, duckies. What did he say? Roared Carmody, but we ignored him. Right, I said. If I have to fight my own battles, so be it. I marched over to the telephone, recently installed in the SCR, as a concession to the Times. If you won't listen to me, perhaps you'll listen to the police. The police? Neighed the master. Really, Mr. Borthwick, if we can't settle this little matter without calling in outside authorities, what has become of academic freedom? I didn't deign to answer, and was just beginning to dial when the master spoke again, with that authoritative undertone to his whine that always got his point across. Mr. Borthwick, you really must be careful, you know. I don't think you have quite thought this thing through. What do you mean? I demanded. Well, let us say, for argument's sake, that we are all in it, as you put it a moment ago. It will be very easy, will it not, for us, all of us, to inform the police of a most unfortunate altercation, really quite violent, that took place last week between you and poor Whitling. Altercation? There was no altercation. I hardly spoke to the man if I could help it. Precisely. Your hostility was well known to us, and in an enclosed community such as our own, it is well known how little things can fester and become great ones. There was that altercation, as I say, on the subject of, what was it? Milton's debt to Virgil. Yes, I think that was it. We all heard it, of course. Now, would the police believe your story of a collusion between a large number of elderly and impeccably respectable academic gentlemen to murder one of their colleagues? Or would they not rather accept our unanimous view that you, your mind unhinged perhaps by the notorious infidelities of your wife, had a brainstorm and decided to do away with the colleague with whom you were publicly on the worst of terms? That's ridiculous. Or, say, our splendid British police discovered that this was the work of one man, say Mr. Peddy, say Mr. Carmody, say even myself, leaving the rest of the SCR intact. You have been so taken up, I fear, with the terms of the fellowship in ancient Persian that you have forgotten the terms of your own fellowship. My own? As some of us here remember, when the Jeremy Collier Fellowship in English was established, English was still a comparatively new university subject. Many of us hoped it would go away. So, in their wisdom, the governing fellows made this fellowship renewable every 5 years. But that's just a formality. It has been hitherto, quite. We have been generous, as is our habit. However, the fellowship comes up for renewal, does it not, next year? I think you may find that the SCR will not take kindly to the idea of renewing the fellowship of one who had been responsible for arraigning one of their colleagues on a capital charge. Damned bad form, said Carmody. Quite, said Peddy. Quite, said all of them, sounding like a flock of ducks in St. James's Park. You wouldn't dare, I said. But my voice sounded hollow. I think you would find that to get a job at your time of life is far from easy. A cold academic wind is blowing, is it not, Borthwick? Positions are being abolished rather than created, I believe. I'm told that even in the colonies the universities are no longer the refuge for Oxonians that they once were. And though you are a great reader, Borthwick, you are hardly a prolific writer, are you? Isn't that what they want these days? Acres of little papers on this and that. It doesn't bear thinking about, does it, Borthwick? One of the great army of 3 million unemployed. I took my hand slowly from the telephone. He had me over a bubbling cauldron of boiling oil. When threatened where it hurts most, our jobs and our pockets, we liberal intellectuals do not hesitate, or rather, we hesitate because that is our natures. But in the end, I took a symbolic step away from the telephone. Splendid, neighed the master, rubbing his hands. I felt quite sure that you'd see you'd been mistaken. Sad that the death of a respected and valued colleague should have been disfigured in this way. Now I fear I must to the residence to set in motion the necessary formalities. He looked around the room carefully. He took up the little file from the table and hurled it into the fire. Then he took the copy of the Sun and placed it carefully in his briefcase. I shall ring Lockett, talk to the old man. I'll tell him to bring along a certificate for you to sign, Pritchard Jones. Perhaps you would stay here too, Peddy, to see if there's anything else. The rest of us can go. I think Borthwick will quite understand if you are too upset to attend tomorrow's meeting. You have taken the death of your friend very hard. We can all see that. I shall propose to change the terms of the Hetherington Fellowship to one in Chinese. I think Wickling would have approved, with his concern for the older languages. And it will show that we in Potties can, in our small way, adapt ourselves to the new patterns of the modern world. And that's how it turned out. We appointed 2 new fellows. One was a Chinese scholar of great age and Buddha-like inscrutability. The other, an elderly Winchester schoolmaster who was having disciplinary problems. They fitted in very well. Life in college goes on pretty much as before. For a time, I didn't care to go to high table. I dined constantly at home, driving my wife into a frenzy of irritation. Even when I started to eat in hall again, I avoided the port. But time it takes the edge off most things. Now I take my glass of Founder's Port with the rest, with scarcely a thought. It's amazing what we liberal intellectuals can take in our strides when we set our minds to it.
If you like that story, consider supporting me as a patron. That way you help me make more stories for you and get access to a patrons-only library of stories. Lots more hours for you to listen to.
So that was The Oxford Way of Death by Robert Barnard. I'm going to say something about him, but I thought that was a really funny story. So Barnard was born, he was a renowned English crime writer, was born on November the 23rd, 1936 in Burnham on Crouch in Essex. He went to Colchester Royal Grammar School, then on to Balliol College, Oxford. He pursued an academic path, but he didn't stay at Oxford. He went to as a lecturer in English at the University of New England in Australia and later at the University of Tromsø in Norway. And when he was there, in 1978, I think, he wrote his first crime novel, Death of an Old Goat. And his characteristic trademark was intricate plotting, satire, and humour. So I think this is a really satirical story. So I wanted to say something because as I was going through that, I'll tell you how I got to this story. I was going to read another story by somebody else from the same anthology, which is English detective stories. Great, edited by Patricia Craig. Really good collection. You can get it really cheaply on World of Books or whatever. Now, so the story I was going to read started off as I started with it. It was recommended, but I started with it, and the first scene is the protagonist. This is not this story. This is one I rejected. Meeting or being accosted by a 16-year-old street prostitute in a plastic Mac, and I thought, oh, the listeners aren't going to like this. So I thought, no, I can't do that. So I thought, right, yeah, okay, that sounds fun. I didn't know a lot about the story at the time. And I liked it as soon as I was into it. I thought it was really funny. I mean, some of the lines actually cracked me up. Like when she had that topless picture of her, and this old goat says that is probably after she lost her faith. That made me laugh. A lot of it made me laugh, actually. So, and I thought as we're going through, it's misogynistic, it's racist, it's xenophobic, it's homophobic. It's everything. It's everything you want, everything you don't want these days. I'm not saying any of these things are good. I'm just saying there they were, and I'm like, as I'm going through it, oh, right, okay. I hope, and it's also really critical of progressives, isn't it? Really, it's critical of reactionaries as well, and progressives. I think he's shooting them both. Now, when you read it, you might think, oh yes, this is a guy who's and I think it's the same mistake we make. We think if a writer writes something, what he writes represents his views, and that isn't true. Barnard was he critiqued the British political landscape and social landscape, but he worked for the Fabian Society, which is a socialist organisation. So the Fabian Society, I'm going to pick up a bit of his acerbic nature. So the Fabian Society is a part of the British Socialist Party, the Labour Party, who are very nice middle class people, typically puritanical, who want to tell the working class how to behave and want the working class to behave nicely. And it seems to me and that isn't to say they're not all good people. They start off with good aims, but I find them quite patronising. Anyway, he worked for them. He wrote a book called Political Suicide, 1984, as a satire on British politics, lampooning the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, and the Liberal Alliance as it was then. And he at that time had come to believe that many politicians are untrustworthy and inept. I think that's a pretty widespread belief these days, certainly in the UK. But anyway, he wrote 40 novels, and he was very satirical about all sorts of aspects of British society. He wrote a book called Death on the High Seas, because he was really passionate about opera, death in a cold climate, a nod to his time in Norway. And he used the pseudonym Bernard Bastable, crafting novels with Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart as a detective. He was very highly regarded, and he won the Cartier Diamond Dagger from the Crime Writers Association in 2003. He died in 2013, he was 76, in Leeds, West Yorkshire, where he spent much of his later life. So let's talk about the story itself. So it was first published in his collection, The Death of a Salesperson, actually also titled The Death of a Salesman. I'm not sure who got which title and which precedes which, but certainly you can find the details as both salesperson and salesman. It's published by the Collins Crime Club, and this story was later republished in English Detective Stories by Oxford University Press, 1992, I think the one I've got, but 1990 as well. Anyway, St. Pothinus' Hall, or Pothinus' Hall, doesn't exist, but it's an Oxford college steeped in tradition, a symbol of academic inertia. Aging fellows cling to their posts, more invested in personal comfort than scholastic excellence. In fact, they're appalled by the idea of anything like progress or achievement or merit. The guy who died creating the post, in ancient Persian, had managed not to have any undergraduates. Imagine that, getting paid and not have anything much to do. I guess he could have written his papers, but they even scorn that. The current academic, as I understand, and I'm not an academic, how you get on in academia is you write lots of papers. I've been, an aside, I decided I was going to teach myself Gothic literature because I looked at the university courses and they want to take like 10 grand a year off me. And I thought I can do this through books and YouTube videos. Anyway, so I got the course books, the Cambridge Gothic Literature, Companion to Gothic Literature, and there are some gems in there really, but a lot of it is this turgid academic drivel where they just write stuff for the sake of writing, and the monstrously torturous sentences and concepts and neologisms that they put in. It's like Lovecraft on acid. Becoming an academic and getting their favourite hobby horses in. So when he's critiquing them, I'm like, this is probably pretty accurate. Anyway, so you know the story. There's a gay character there who comes in, who actually says goodnight duckies, which is, there was a language that, and I'm not an expert in this, called Polari, which was like thieves' cant. If you played D&D, you'll know this, which is and Cockney rhyming slang. They're sort of languages that were used by, let's call them marginalised groups, Cockneys, marginalised groups, to that was a joke, to hide what they were doing from the eyes of their betters, like the Fabians. Sorry, Callie's saying she's growling at somebody in her sleep. I don't know why. If she gets too bad, I'll give her a cuddle and wake her up because I don't like her to be upset in her dreams. So anyway, yeah. And the gay community had its own language, Polari, and it was, its own idiolect. I think that's a word. And I'm not saying that duckies is that, but it's a nod to it. It's a nod to kind of gay-coded words and probably a slur to put them in, really. You would say that, a homophobic slur, I would imagine. And the Sun newspaper, if you don't know, was a newspaper. I don't think it does it now. It used to have a page 3 girl, which would be a topless girl. So this young African who is attractive, who is young, who is an expert in ancient Persian, a great performer. She was at the Footlights and goes topless at times, who'd lost her faith. This is going to be a challenge to these guys. So I think you can kind of get your knickers in a twist about the fact that they are prejudiced, or you can actually see the fact it's taking the mickey out of them. That's the joke, that these aged dinosaurs, they're so reactionary and opposed to change. They'll kill somebody. First of all, we have Whitley, who's he doesn't care about diversity. He's just trying to wind these people up. and just gets an evil, malicious pleasure from upsetting his colleagues. But you can understand that because you do want to poke them, don't you? And they are so against change, so reactionary. They'll kill for it. They'll murder somebody for it, right? So of course it's absurd. It is absurd. But there is some. Is it serious social commentary? I wonder if it is. Sometimes. And of course, let's come to the other critique, of course, is the pious, hypocritical liberal who wants to always be seen to be doing the right thing. These are flagged up as causes I should support, this diversity, so I will support them. And I think what Barnard is suggesting is that these are as worthless, these views, because they don't hold up, do they? As soon as there's a challenge to his pocket and his living, he's gonna forget about them. Yeah. So I think he critiques both the ancient dinosaurs, the conservative dinosaurs at the college, but also the empty liberalism, the posturing of Borthwick. And so I think it's a plague on both your houses, really. But so, yeah, if you got upset by that, I think you need to just recalibrate your sense of humour and not take things so seriously, because Barnard certainly didn't, and he was poking fun at everybody, and I certainly got some laughs out of it. We'll see what the comments say. That'll be an interesting one.